afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are all doing well today. My name is Michael Masante, and on behalf of Jeannie Allen and the Center for Education Reform, I want to welcome you to Presidential Inaugurations. I do solemnly swear the transition of power in our republic. While you were waiting, you heard first the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is played at many of our national events of importance, such as inaugurations, the 4th of July, and then Hail to the Chief, which is heard whenever the President of the United States enters an event or a room as an honor to him and possibly one day her. We designed this program a couple of months ago to present what happens with inaugurations, what's actually in the Constitution regarding inaugurations, and also, very exciting to me, the traditions and events that were started by the First Ladies at the very beginning of our republic that we still do today. And we are going to do that because that is what we've prepared for you. And it is very important to remember, especially for any students watching, that these are our events and traditions. And our republic has suffered under many things and many events in the past, and we will in the future. But these are the things that mark our inaugurations and our peaceful transitions of power. And so we are going to address those and learn from them, but we are also going to address the events of last week. I'll have you all know, I'm sitting 7 blocks away from our Capitol building. And last week was very personal for me, as I, prior to COVID, worked very often in that building, and also visited with my family quite often. When you have when you're blessed to live this close to the nation's Capitol building, you visit it often, and we have, and we do, and we will continue to do so when the inauguration events of next week have ended. We are obviously all deeply saddened, and we are affected by what occurred last week, especially by the loss of life and those 2 Capitol Hill police officers who died in the line of duty. I will rejoin later to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to introduce now our Master of Ceremonies, Lawrence Staten, who teaches at Washington Latin Public Charter School, which is also here in the District of Columbia. And he was virtually teaching his children when the events of last week occurred. And so, Lawrence, if you could take a moment to briefly talk about what it was like describing in real time with your students, and then we will get on with our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Once again, it's good to be with you again, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the educators and all of the students who are watching this afternoon, wherever you are. As Michael rightly said, I am an educator in the District of Columbia. I have been teaching for 12 years, and as a civics teacher, last week was one of the hardest and most challenging weeks of my professional career. Like Michael, in a previous life, I had worked on the Hill. I was blessed to work for 2 federal campaigns when I was in college. So those events came and struck me very close to home. And as Michael said, I was teaching. I was in the middle of teaching when the insurrection and the events of last week happened. And so they've asked me to talk a little bit about my practice in the classroom and what did I do? How did I address it with my 6th grade students who, if you're a middle school teacher, you know 6th graders are, 10, 11, maybe 12 years old, and they're starting to form their own unique views and ideas. So on Thursday, when we had a full class together, I gave them an opportunity to share their thoughts because many of my students live very close to the Capitol, and one shared that her parents were afraid that they might actually have to leave their home and evacuate because they didn't know what was going to happen. And when my students asked about it, I was there to share with them, what the Constitution says about things like impeachment, which is currently being debated, what the Constitution shares about the 25th Amendment, which was the subject of much conversation over the weekend. But primarily as an educator, I believed it was my professional responsibility to give them the opportunity to think through critically their own thoughts and their ideas. I shared with them, the American traditions that we have, going all the way back to 1800, to a bitterly contested election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. What makes our country, our republic, so special is the peaceful transfer of power, and this idea that when we have spirited campaigns, we are allowed to do that. We're allowed to have spirited elections and vigorous debate. But when the election is over, the loser congratulates the winner. The winner is magnanimous in victory, and we move forward. I quoted to them Jefferson's first inaugural address, where he said, "We are all Federalists and we are all Republicans." This idea that, after a spirited campaign where we vigorously debate ideas, our country is supposed to unite and have a peaceful transfer of power. And it is challenging when that process becomes so difficult. We talked about, the Civil War, and we talked about, the transfer of power as Abraham Lincoln came into power. We talked about the 2000 election and why it was so important that the country unify after such a bitterly contested election. But what's most important, at least in my, opinion, is that as educators, you give your students the opportunity to explore their ideas critically, and you give them the information they need because you are the professional in the room. You know your students best. You know the information that they need. So trust yourself. Trust your practice. All of you out there are qualified professionals. You know your students best. So what worked for me and my students may not work for you because everyone's circumstances is different. But what is important is to remember that as educators, we have a responsibility to educate and inform our students. And as professionals, we have that responsibility to address current events and think about the events of our government and our world critically, because one day we will no longer be teachers, and it's the students who are watching who will be the leaders, and they need to be properly and critically informed about their responsibilities as Americans and the rights and privileges that come with citizenship. So I'm sure we will talk more about these events of presidential transitions. But for now, it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you Jason Harshman of the National Endowment of the Humanities, who's going to talk a little bit about the oath of office and presidential transition. So Jason, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lawrence. And thank you too for your talk there about the importance of students, right? That's why we're here. That's why we do education. So thank you so much. I, like my colleague, Lawrence and Michael, I am also in Washington, D.C., just a mile north of the Capitol, and still working to process it all. As was mentioned, my name is Jason Harshman. I'm a program officer in the Division of Education at the National Endowment for the Humanities. And the NEH is currently involved with an agency-wide initiative known as A More Perfect Union. And so the opportunity to participate in this video series on why America is certainly in line with the work that we're doing. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about inaugurations and how to engage with primary source materials, and discuss some of the larger constitutional issues that go along with inaugurations, and share some of the materials provided by our website Incitement, and then also be around at the end of this conversation to participate in the panel. January 20th, 2021 will mark the 59th time a president of the United States is inaugurated. The first for George Washington occurred on April 30th, 1789, after a blustery winter delayed for weeks the arrival of members of Congress to New York City. At that time, of course, as we know, that Washington, D.C. was not the center of our government. And so the inauguration took place for George Washington in New York City. They also had to delay the the counting of the electoral ballots until all could arrive, and it took a couple weeks. So by the time the counting of the electoral ballots completed, and that was a unanimous vote, 69 electoral votes for George Washington, they could then proceed with informing him that he had won. It then took a few more weeks for George Washington to make his way from Mount Vernon to New York City to be inaugurated. So it wasn't until the end of April in 1789 that he was inaugurated as the first president. And of course, everything that went into creating that inauguration, creating that event, was new. It had not been done before. And so the decisions that had to be made about not only what had been put in the Constitution with regard to what is said, but how? What is the event? How do we mark this first time inauguration? It's not a coronation. We are not electing a king. And so how do we proceed with this? And so all of that had to be determined at that time. And since then, we have our constitutional practices, but then we also have, as Michael had mentioned in his opening introduction, we have practices and precedents that have been established over time that have become part of the inauguration. And we're going to see some of those next week, Wednesday, but we know that it will be much different this year for a whole host of reasons. Since that first inauguration in 1789, the United States has elected and inaugurated presidents during times of war, economic depression, following assassinations, pandemics, and as FDR notes in his first inaugural address, as you'll see on the slide, times of internal strife. President Lincoln's first inaugural address occurred as the thunder of civil war was rolling, and after a contentious election. He closed that speech by saying, quote, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection," end quote. And so with this in mind, we approach the teaching and learning about inaugurations not through the lens of just anecdotes or trivia or what we know within education can be just looking something up, the just-in-time learning, but rather as an opportunity to explore the constitutional requirements and practices that take place on that day, as well as what has been said and done during and after those events, but also how the nation takes that in and is affected by what is said and done at inaugurations. We think of questions that come directly from the Constitution. What is being preserved and protected? What is being maintained? What could change? And what are we truly witnessing happen at noon on January 20th, every 4 years in the United States? In accordance with the Constitution and the 20th Amendment that moved the inauguration of the president and the vice president from March 4th to January 20th, the 20th Amendment also changed the beginning of a new Congress that moved from March 4th to January 3rd, which we know happened earlier this week. Last week, sorry. And that is also when the nation and the world witness this transition of power. We have had 3 instances in the past when an incumbent president has not attended the inauguration: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. But we do know that current and former presidents attend, office holders from the current and previous administrations, members of Congress, dignitaries who witnessed this constitutional act. And as is the nature of elections, there are times when incumbents have stood witness to the swearing in of an opponent, now to be president and vice president, that they lost to. In fact, since 1960, we have had 7 elections in which the candidate that lost was an incumbent president or the vice president running for election. So just thinking about that time period of 60 years, we have found ways to be able to unite and move forward with the preservation of the Union. It makes for a very powerful moment when the oath of office is taken, and then that is followed by the inaugural address. And so if we move ahead now, you'll see, just to talk a little bit about inaugural addresses, we'll move back 1 slide. Thank you. In addition to being able to access I know I'm working with educators. It's that element of surprise sometimes that can be lost, but it's okay. We're going to move back one slide. And so we offer a Capitol Parade on a cold winter's day. This is a closer reading that pulls together all of our resources at Excitement. And these are materials that are designed for K-12 educators. We do provide lessons about Abraham Lincoln's first and second inaugural addresses with questions and activities that prompt students to engage in inquiry-based investigations about not just the speeches, but the historical context of those speeches. Those speeches include such lines as "are better angels" and "not being enemies," and of course, discussion of the preservation of our union. We also offer a lesson that is specific not to the discussion of the oath of office, but also the constitutional requirements and the practices that have emerged. So within that lesson, you're going to see a timeline of how precedent has been set and then interpretations of those precedents, different Bibles that have been used to swear in a president, even though there is no mention of using a Bible for the swearing in. We also you'll be able to investigate questions regarding these traditions, such as how did it come to be that where or by whom the oath is administered, because that is not included in the Constitution either. And of course, now we know that it is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who does that. That was not the case at Washington's first inauguration, but at some point, we know that that became the common practice. If you look at images and videos of the speeches, you'll see that it was held not always at the Capitol building. In fact, you'll even see different seating arrangements of the justices and the sitting or outgoing president. So we have a lot of change that occurs over time. With the resource that you see on the screen here, we have a collection of materials available that include the Backstory podcast entitled 4 More Years, Presidential Inaugurations. And I think when you're using inaugural addresses in your in a history or civics course, you may focus on content, and this again becomes the basis for our inquiry-based approaches. For example, you may consider questions such as, what is the historical context of the inaugural address? So we want to find out why a president who has been reelected or a new president focuses on particular themes or specific examples, be it domestic or international, within that speech. What are they addressing at that time? And you'll see discussions of slavery, you'll see discussions of depression and war, whether it be specific such as World War II or a more global war on terror. What is it about the time at which this inauguration is occurring that is going to influence some of what is included in the speech? We also know that inaugural addresses can be used as introductions to units of study. U.S. history tends to focus on U.S. presidents, their administrations, key events, key policies. Were those policies planned from the inauguration? How do we use an inaugural address not only as a way to introduce an administration, but in a way, a kind of checklist or a criteria to help us evaluate the extent to which what happened over the course of the next 4 years, or perhaps even 8 years, actually reached those goals? And how did they affect the nation? In whose interest were those policies developed, and to what end? For a language arts instructor, I think we can also consider how you might engage with a rhetorical analysis of the speeches. So you may not deal as much with the content, but as a way to think as a humanities instructor, how might you analyze the speech? How is it written in terms of its organization, but then also thinking about as well, how is it presented? How does that compare to a campaign speech? What has changed? So I think there's an analysis that can be done in the language arts classroom as well. We also offer materials on the poetry that has been presented. We have there's no discussion of having a poet at your inauguration, but we have seen on a few occasions poets Robert Frost, Maya Angelou, Elizabeth Alexander, who have presented poems during those inaugurations. And we offer materials so that you can use those speeches in your classroom. So as you're thinking about how you're going to engage students with creating something out of what you study about the inauguration, I encourage you to think diversely about those outputs, because there are poems, there are musicians who perform. We've seen graphic art and paintings and portraits that are done about about inauguration. So there are all sorts of resources that we provide on inaugurations, but they can also be used to inspire students to think about how and express how they're interpreting what's happening at an inauguration. In addition to the lesson plans that we offer and included in that, we also offer materials on the First Ladies, which of course we have the pleasure of hearing from today. So it's edcitement.neh.gov, and you can find us on social media as well.
Thank you very much, Jason. And
Thank you,
Jason,
Jason.
we're going to ask you to stick around a little bit. We want you to interact as well with our First Ladies. Lawrence, if you could bring in our honored guests, I would greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to introduce to you as we begin this process of transitioning arguably to a new, not arguably, we will be transitioning to a new first family. It's important to talk about the role of the ladies, the first ladies of these United States, and some of the traditions that they bring to the United States. The role of the First Lady is not defined in the Constitution, so it falls to the individuals who have taken on the role to define it for themselves and for the country. So it is my high honor to introduce the First Ladies of these United States. Allow me to introduce Madam First Lady Martha Washington, Madam First Lady Abigail Adams, and Madam First Lady Dolly Madison. Madam First Ladies, it's an honor to have you with us. So please share with us your thoughts on the role of the First Lady.
Very pleased to be here.
Likewise, indeed, I am honored to be in this accompaniment.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here with all of you today.
Well, and I thank you, Dr. Staton, for your introduction, and Mr. Harshman, if that was you who chose that slide that had a very early portrait of yours truly, that was about 40 years ago, God help me. So when I was just a blushing bride when that portrait was made, so thank you for the complimentary one. Anyway, I do want to acknowledge that and note that my husband actually, when he became Vice President of the United States, he actually took his oath of office 9 days before General Washington. So there was a little bit of a delay, even more so with General's arrival. And then a miraculous thing happened 8 years later. And the world really did not know what to make of it, but there would be a peaceful transference of power when General Washington chose to step down after 8 years of service as the President of the United States. And then my husband became the President of the United States. Now, it was a peaceful transference of power, as they say, for the first time. The second transference of power would not be so peaceful. So I do apologize that my husband and my son both chose not to be at their successors' inaugurations, but being of different parties, regardless of what General Washington had warned us about partisan politics, indeed, the country had indeed fractioned off into two distinct parties, the Federalists, of which my husband was one, and the Democratic Republicans, which Mr. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. So if we want more explanation of those two parties, well, I'd be happy to discuss that, but I know we have many more things to talk about. So when my husband did become the President of the United States, when George Washington became the President of the United States, we, as their consorts, had nothing to follow, no precedent to follow, no established protocols. And indeed, Lady Washington and I were not even in the same federal cities with our husbands when they were inaugurated. So we had much to do to bring our entire households first to New York and then to Philadelphia. So, Lady Washington, would you like to tell us more about your first experience?
I most certainly would be pleased to do so. But may I begin by saying that I personally had little thought that when the War of Independence was finished, that there could have been any circumstances that could possibly have conspired that would draw the general back into the public life again. But of course, in that I was disappointed, and yet I cannot blame my husband for having acted according to his ideas of duty in obeying the voice of his country. But I was well aware that my life and the life of our family would become deranged once more, just as it had become deranged during that War of Independence. But as to our experience in being the first heads of state within a republic, as opposed, of course, to a monarchy, there were many dilemmas that were faced, and Congress themselves faced quite the dilemma in how to create a Republican court. And mind you, don't you dare ever use that word court in front of an anti-federalist, unless you desire to hear an earful. But first and foremost of the dilemmas was what title to call the chief executive. Now, the Senate and Mrs. Adams, as you are quite well aware, the Senate being led by your own husband, Mr. John Adams, your husband had quite the preference for formal titles for the chief executive. And there were many suggestions that he made, and I might humbly say that some of them were quite pretentious. Yes, His Mightiness, your most benign highness, and of course, benign being serene, I can say that that would have been highly inappropriate, as serenity is something I have rarely seen within the president. But the longest of the titles, yes, 18 words. Now, I'm not sure I will remember it correctly, but I will try. His Highness, the President of the United States of America and protector of the rights of the same. Now, that is a title in excess, but most fortunately, it was the House of Representatives, along with my own husband, who preferred the much simpler title of the President or Mr. President. But what of the consort? What should I be called? May I confess that some desire to say I should take upon myself the title of Our Lady Presidentress. Well, now, perhaps someday that might be considered appropriate, but no, I am far happier to be simply Mrs. Washington, although there are some who call me Lady Washington. I was done by the soldiers during the war.
Well, Lady Washington, that is indeed how I do refer to you, and you are always first and foremost a wonderful lady. As for myself, I was quite ridiculed by the press and often called Mrs. President, which was not a complimentary title at all. And indeed, in that very same Congress and Senate that were trying to come up with a title for His Excellency George Washington, they did indeed suggest the idea that John Adams, rather than be vice president, should be called His Superfluous Excellency. Happily, vice president was what stuck. Now, when he did become president, your husband, Lady Washington, was at John's inauguration. And I remember, again, we were not. We were still home taking care of the myriad of things that had to be dealt with before we could move to be with our husbands. But my husband wrote to me that the general being there, he said it was a very solemn scene, and it was indeed made more affecting to him by the presence of the general, whose countenance was as serene and unclouded as the day. Oh, John said he, George Washington, seemed to enjoy a triumph over me. Methought I heard him say, I am fairly out, and you are fairly in.
Very true.
See which of us will be the happiest. And when the ceremony was over, he came and made a visit to my husband, cordially congratulated him, and wished the administration might be happy, successful, and honorable. So yes, indeed, a peaceful transference of power was made. Now, Mrs. Madison, you actually at least were in the federal city for Mr. Madison's inauguration.
Oh, I was. In fact, Jimmy and I had moved to Washington City for the Jefferson administration in 1801, as my husband was the Secretary of State for that administration. So in fact, I was in Washington City through all of the Jefferson administration, along with my husband's time in office. And when after Jimmy took his oath, of course, we did discuss earlier on March 4th, Jefferson was in the room with him, which I thought was quite nice. He sat at the front of the room. Oh, and Mr. Jefferson has been a dear friend of mine for many years back from our time in Philadelphia. And Mr. Madison, President Madison, my Jimmy, he did not quite enjoy what I had in store for him after taking the oath of office. First, we had a get together of sorts at our house on F Street, followed by an inauguration ball at Long's Hotel. And tickets were sold for $4. And I've been told that upwards of 400 people attended. And I've also been told that this practice of an inauguration ball has continued ever since. Now, for myself, I do love the interaction with those that are in attendance. I enjoy talking to them. It does not matter which party they belong to or where they reside. Everyone has something to bring into the room, and I love to speak with them and hear what they have to say. But I must tell you that after all was said and done, and all the food was put away, and the beautiful clothes were put away, my dear sweet James Madison felt that he was exhausted by the event and was looking forward to getting back to work.
Well, when you think about that inauguration and the ball that you experienced, as Mrs. Adams has already said, I was still at Mount Vernon when the president had taken the oath of office in April of 1789. So I did indeed miss all the festivities of the inauguration. It was delayed. There was a celebration that evening, a very large celebration with a great press of people in the streets. Barely, as I've been told, could Washington be able to walk through them. But nevertheless, Betsy Hamilton told me that at that celebration at the ball, which was May 7th, I still not being there, that every woman who was present received a fan that had been prepared in Paris. And then when opened, it displayed a likeness of the president in profile. Isn't that lovely indeed? But I followed the president a month later, having gathered up many of our belongings, several of my people, of course, and my 2 young grandchildren. And I recall that from the moment I arrived in New York City, where the Capitol was held that first year, I had not 1 half hour to myself. Prior to my arrival in the city, it had been announced in the papers that neither the president nor his wife would be free to accept or host any private social invitations for fear of a show of favoritism, I shall suppose. But this decision was made without my knowledge, and certainly without my consent. I accepted it, perhaps a bit grudgingly, as my duty. And I confessed again to Betsy Hamilton that, to my mind, with such restrictions were put upon me, that if the president was called the chief executive of the land, then was not his wife, surely, the chief state prisoner? Well, ladies, perhaps you can understand better than anyone. I will forever, Mrs. Adams, be grateful for your sociability during that difficult time, as together we could be able to comfort each other. But rather than private invitations, Congress established levees, public receptions. And the president's levee would be held on a Tuesday afternoon for gentlemen only, whereas Mrs. Washington's levee was held on Friday evenings and was open to both gentlemen and ladies. Now, the importance of our levees is undeniable. Their decorum, their formality, it establishes a protocol which will appeal to those accustomed to royal courts. But as they are open without any invitation, these levees, they lend a republican air to our new nation. It was after, of course, that first year in New York that I did some politicking of my own, convincing the president of the cruelty of curtailing my own liberties. And when the capital moved to Philadelphia, I lived a much more unfettered life. And I could host and accept my own invitations. Well, throughout the course of the war, I had formed connections with many of the prominent ladies of Philadelphia City, and to have deprived me of their society, as you well understand, would have been unkind indeed.
Well, and the critics, indeed, in the newspapers, they accused you and General Washington of developing what they called a creeping monarchy. It was most unkind. Most unkind indeed. Now, those folks, they have actually never really seen a creeping monarchy firsthand, but I spent quality time in England and visiting the court of St. James. First time I attended, my daughter and I had spent the entire morning being attired in a fashion that could only be considered out of date with what was considered the current mode. And the drawing room at the palace began at 2 o'clock. We were placed in a circle around the room, there being about 200 people present, no place for people to sit, no refreshments to be had, which at your levees, Lady Washington, there were seats for those and there were refreshments in the other rooms. There was a freedom, a democratic republican sense of freedom at the levees. Now, only think the task that the royal family would have. The king would come into the room and he would begin to go around one way while the queen came into the room and went around the other way. And they each had to make small talk with these 200 personages present. Quite a tedious task, I will say. Now, when the king finally came to me, I drew my glove off of my hand. He saluted me on my left cheek and then asked me if I'd taken a walk that day. I could have told His Majesty that I'd been all morning prepared to wait upon him and his wife and family, but instead I replied, "No, sire." "Why, don't you love walking?" said he. I answered that I guess I was rather indolent in that regard. He then bowed and moved on, and I had to wait another 2 hours for the Queen to come to me. Now that is quite literally an example of a creeping monarchy. Yes. Now, Mrs. Madison, you had a different challenge to overcome, whereas I took on Lady Washington's pattern of sophistication and levees and Republican egalitarianism. You, poor dear, you had to follow Mr. Jefferson.
Yes, certainly I did. But so the good thing here, the positive way of looking at things is that dear Mr. Jefferson was a friend, and I was able to witness his official behavior, I guess I should say. He decided to forego any access to the White House, as it has now been known. Besides, of course, on the 4th of July and on New Year's Day, though perhaps he was slightly of ill humor with me as I started to open the doors to our house on F Street on New Year's Day as well. And some have said that the frivolities were, how should I put it, more of a celebration than of that with President Jefferson. And I must say thank you to both of the ladies before me, because you paved a way that I could not have done without your stepping in. You did so much before my time that I had nothing but to open the doors and welcome people. Every Wednesday, our drawing rooms, which became known as squeezes, quite a few people would show up. So it would get a bit, you have to squeeze into the room. And we had them every Wednesday night. We had as much access for the people of Washington City as possible. And it was important to us to have food and drink, and perhaps on occasion there was a bit of gambling.
Mrs. Madison, did you not have to overcome a diplomatic triumph? Well, actually, it could have been a catastrophe in Mr. Jefferson's, his term with the
Yes.
Murray, Ambassadors Murray.
Yes, unfortunately, Mr. Jefferson did not follow much decorum, as he would welcome dignitaries from other countries in his robe and slippers. And in one particular occasion, Mr. Murray did appear, and he arrived, and Mr. Jefferson did not follow any protocol that a dignified person of power would bring into a room. And after he offended both Mr. Murray and his wife, my husband and Mr. Jefferson wrote a pamphlet on the new United States Acts of Decorum, which they post-dated. Now, Jimmy and I invited Mr. Murray and his wife to our home for a meal to try to solve the issue, but I must say it went as best as it could. But Mr. Murray was deeply offended by the confusion of the correct way of behaving in this new republic.
And on that note, ladies, I'm sorry, Miss Madison, I'm going to cut in because we do have some questions, but I do want, and we do have a number of people watching, and I have been a citizen of Washington City for 30 years now. And Madam First Ladies, regrettably, we've had some challenges here in 2021. And there were a number of things that have occurred, but there are very important things that occurred in the midst of this trouble, this insurrection, which is the best word to describe it. It was in the middle of the certification of the electoral ballots. And these ballots, while just paper and being kept in a wooden box, are critical to what is supposed to be a simple ceremony. And in the moment of despair, in the moment of great tragedy for the nation, these boxes were grabbed and saved by staffers of Capitol Hill folks, the parliamentarians whose job it is. And I know, and this question is direct to Ms. Madison, you had some challenges in President Madison's as well, where there was an event that occurred with the British, and you had to remove a number of critical documents, and I believe a portrait of Lady Washington's dear husband, our first president. I was hoping that you could quickly tell us a little bit about that to show an example of how our country continues to overcome some challenges, and that things that have occurred in the past, and we as a republic continue to move forward.
I can speak only as a woman, as you can well understand, and the power of a woman is greatly constrained in my time, so that you are well aware of that. And yet still in awe, I look forward, as I can only do, to what the future will be able to hold, and what will the new generations have a responsibility to attend to. I would hope that for each new generation, we would stand to answer the call of duty. For our lives are forked. Which path are we going to choose? Are we going to choose our duty as the citizens of a republic? Are we going to choose our own inclination and to desire to serve only ourselves? This is the choice that must be made by each individual in our nation. And as a people, I will humbly say that we must be willing at times to sacrifice our private interests, our comforts for the sake of our duty. And the consciousness of having attempted to do all the good in your own power, the pleasure of finding your fellow citizens to be well satisfied with your conduct, that will doubtless be a compensation to you. But above all, the choice of performing our duty as citizens over our inclinations that are personal will benefit the common good of this country. And only then will it secure its future. Now, I apologize if I have spoken out of turn as a woman, but when asked my opinion, well, that is something that a woman might be able to do. We will use our influence, even in my own time, to help to sway and to bring up that next generation. I hope that will satisfy.
Is that
I just wanted to go back to your question to Mrs. Madison, because Lady Washington, over your, I believe it's your left, your right shoulder, is a portrait of the general. And that is indeed the very portrait that Mr. Musante was talking about, Mrs. Madison having saved during an event. It's beyond your time, Lady Washington, I realize, and heaven actually preserved that you were not around to see the burning of our capital city. But Mrs. Madison sacrificed all those things that all of her possessions pretty much, in order to save public documents and that portrait. Mrs. Madison?
Oh, we did, yes. Mr. Madison, President Madison, sent me a letter asking me to stay in the house, and he asked me to collect some papers and various effects. And we filled an entire carriage with papers.
May I say, the British were marching on the federal city. We had had our independence for but a few decades. We were still but a young country, but we had been fighting a war since basically 1812. And some would call it Mr. Madison's War, some call it the War of 1812, depending on which side you were on, I suppose. But it was a second war for American independence. And as they were marching upon the Capitol, there you were, Mrs. Madison, in harm's way.
It was, and while this war is sometimes referred to as the War of 1812, it was the year of 1814. This was 2 years into this battle. And Mr. Madison was with the troops, and I was in the house. Fortunately for me, my sweet son was over in London, so he was not around. And I kept moving myself onto the roof of the house with my spyglass to look to see if the troops were coming closer to the house. I was warned multiple times to leave, but my Jimmy told me to stay, and so I did. And I waited until the last possible moment. And I packed away papers, notes on the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, and various effects that seemed far too important to leave behind. The silverware, I took the red drapes, which there were eagles on the end of the curtain rods as well, which of course we had designed so specifically for this important building. But one thing was still up that I thought, this is a good thing to bring with us. If someone was if the British were to arrive and see this painting, as you can see by Mrs. Washington's shoulder there, this painting here, if the British soldiers were to march into the house and see this painting, well, they could take the painting. They could take it back to England. They could march it around the streets to show their power over us as a new nation. And so I ordered it taken down. The frame was screwed into the wall, and it proved to be too much of a problem as we were running quickly out of time. So we had the frame broken. and the painting rolled up and handed to two gentlemen from New York, who took the painting with them to safety. Now, mind you, this was a copy. This was not the original painting, which of course I knew, but perhaps the British soldiers would not, and that would not matter to them anyway.
Not at all. And may I add, Mrs. Madison, that it is the symbolism of what Mr. Gilbert Stuart painted that was so important. For this portrait is of a Republican leader. It is not that of a king, and therefore it is not someone assuming power for themselves. While it is not a throne, it is a chair of state with the flag in the corner. And every moment of my husband has been painted here to represent not a man of war, but a man of peace, of diplomacy. The Ark of the Covenant suggested in that inkwell the storm clouds of war and disturbance, and yet the hope of the rainbow, that peace that will come, the great symbolism of this portrait. And it may appear in your own time that each of the details that we have experienced are nothing but trivial. Oh, what does it matter what someone's going to be called? Or what does it matter if we say the oath with a Bible or without a Bible? What does it matter? But for us, every detail was new, and we were establishing the first. What does a republic look like? And so that which would appear trivial in your own time was of great importance in our own. Again, I apologize, but I did want to make that clear as to why Mrs. Madison would have such a great concern to preserve this portrait of Mr. Washington.
Yes, and we thank you for that. And it has come out also, Miss Madison, that one of our attendees have pointed out, I believe that it was enslaved gentlemen who you have asked to break the frame and save the portrait, and they assisted in that, carrying it to safety.
Yes, they did. They did, and we are all very grateful for it.
I'm bringing back Jason. Jason, we have coming up this Tuesday on January 20th, obviously, President-elect Biden and his inauguration. And while it will be a toned down ceremony, not just because of January 6th and the horrible event of that day, the insurrection, but also because of COVID. Quite frankly, there were going to be major changes. And if you could quickly just shed some light on perhaps some of the things that we'll see or that will occur, that would be great, if you could.
I believe in terms of adjustments that are being made, that there will be a shortened, or at least there was going to be, I don't know of the details based on this. I know there was a security briefing yesterday about what next Wednesday will look like. But I believe that they were already planning a virtual parade that was going to bring together the states and the territories for people to participate in. They've canceled all of the events that would have been held at the Capitol, such as the luncheon that's typically held. There will be no tradition of sending off onto Marine One and then Air Force One. So I believe, to my knowledge, because of the last week, that even the abbreviated of what was going to happen has also been canceled. So I believe there, last I saw, they were still planning to hold the swearing in, the oath of office, and inaugural address at the Capitol, but where at the Capitol, I believe that is still being discussed.
If I can, oh, forgive me.
Well, I would just like to add a word from posterity to the future generations of supreme magistrates, presidents, may they be men or perhaps even in the future women, if we do not hold the reins of government yet, I see no reason why we should not be critical of how they're conducted and ultimately aspire perhaps to having a position within it. But anyway, my husband, before he left office, he did leave a prayer for the American people and for the future presidency. He said, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men," may I add women possibly, "ever rule under this roof." And that continues to be inscribed in the mantle of the presidential dining room of the presidential house.
Lawrence, please.
One of the things that may surprise you all, Madam's First Lady, is that the role of the First Lady has become much more political today. Many First Ladies often take on a portfolio, a policy portfolio. How did you all view the political role of the First Lady in terms of political parties? What were your thoughts on the political role?
And I would just add quickly, ladies, I'm sorry, if you could please be quick in your response, as we are coming up on time and we wouldn't want to keep you a moment later than we could. But please, we would be very much interested in hearing your responses to that question.
Well, I will very quickly say for myself that the role of the First Lady should always be a role that supports the work of the presidency and the work of the people in some way, I would think. But myself, that is what is most important. How can I strengthen the role of the presidency? And that would be what I would hope that other First Ladies would also consider to be important. But that is just my own. Please, Mrs. Adams.
I will say you achieved great things, Lady Washington, because the general was always much more happy when you were around. As far as my own, take on the role, first of all, I must say we were not called First Ladies. We were the wives of the president. We were the president's consort. There were any number of things, but we had no official title. So this idea of First Lady is somewhat new to all of us. But anyway, as far as myself, I had always been, I guess, a sounding board for my husband's politics. He and I are quite in agreement on things. And indeed, when we first met, our courtship was based upon conversation, but conversation about the issues of the day. When we were in a room together, we were like steel and magnet, and we would fly together and thus remain engaged in conversation about the issues for the better part of every evening. And that did not change within our married life. And indeed, I was highly criticized. I would receive my husband's mail. I would read his husband's mail. I would indeed foment opinions, share them with him. And there were those actually when it was finally determined that we should not go to war with France, so this is early in my husband's presidency, there were those, I was not in town at the time, and there were those who said, well, it's a shame that his old woman isn't around because perhaps things would have been differently. Those who wanted us to go to war thought that perhaps if I had been in town, I might have been able to persuade my husband to such a thing. Now, I would not have. I did not really believe that war was prudent for us at the time, like my husband determined. But that is why I got termed Mrs. President, and it was not a compliment.
And Miss Madison.
No, my husband, Mr. Madison, and I did have a beautiful marriage and friendship, I must say. When he was elected to office, his opponent was known to say that he might have had a better chance had he gone against Mr. Madison alone. For I found myself having conversations with anyone who would listen. At our squeezes, it was noted that while I was speaking with folks, that you could not tell if who I was speaking to was Mr. Madison's friend or foe. Because while there were and are different political parties, I found it much more important to learn the person that I was speaking to, so that they found a place to to speak freely, to find those who agreed with their policies and politics and those who did not. But quite different from being on the House, they were able to speak in a more peaceful room, as there were ladies about.
Well, it will be comforting to know that we are getting closer. We now have a first, second gentleman as the and I think I got that right.
Now that is a confusing title.
Yes, it is. But the vice president,
to say that
the vice president of the United States is now a woman, and her husband will be first gentleman. No, second gentleman. Excuse me. My apologies. It's even confusing in this, but I think we are definitely getting closer. And I think the importance of your wisdom today, ladies, is once again to show that we have been at this great experiment called the United States of America for some time. And Jason, your organization's motto of "Toward a More Perfect Union," do I have that right?
Yeah, that's the initiative. But in our founding legislation, democracy requires wisdom.
Yes, and that is what we were trying to do today. Wisdom comes from not just age, but education and experience. And the better the education, the more the wisdom and the life experiences we would all hope would add up to a educated populace that I believe our republic cannot do without. And so as we continue forward with all of these great challenges that we are facing, I would just simply say that we hope and pray that this coming Tuesday passes, and at noon we will have a new president, and we will begin to move forward as a nation, as a unified nation, and that we can put these dark days behind us. And as Jeannie Allen in her latest piece in Forbes said, let our better angels prevail. And so prior to just closing us up today, if I could have the slide about our essay contest, I would greatly appreciate it. One thing we are asking to do is to ask students, with guidance from their teachers, exactly what it means, what our nation and what our republic means, and what the founding fathers, along with the help of their wives and others, set in motion and put into place for all of us to enjoy and make stronger. And I think that is all of our roles. And so hopefully you will encourage your students to engage and please send in an essay. First ladies, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate your presence. Jason, I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for your information today, and we will put that website link back up on for all of our attendees to see. Mr. Staten, always a pleasure, sir, and we greatly appreciated your input and your personal story today. And I will assure you all that we will continue to hold these to ensure that we can pass on more of why America and movement towards a more perfect union. Thank you all so much for joining us today. God bless all of you, and God bless the United States of America.
Indeed.